3 weeks after her husband's funeral, her own daughter told her, "Work or leave." At 68, grieving and unwanted, she rang a stranger's mansion door, only to come face to face with the man who had promised to marry her 48 years ago. 3 weeks after burying her husband of 45 years, a 68-year-old woman stood in her own kitchen, still wearing black, and heard her daughter say, "Either you work or you're out. Not next month. Not when you're ready. Not when the grief softens. Now, I want you to sit with that image before we go any further." Funeral flowers still fresh. Sympathy cards stacked on the counter. The smell of a man's aftershave still clinging to the hallway he once walked through every morning. And in the middle of that fragile silence, your own child informs you that your place in the house you built has an expiration date. This is Empathetic Stories. And if you've ever felt replaced, dismissed, or quietly erased inside your own family, I need you to stay with me. Because this story is not just about betrayal. It's about dignity. It's about second chances. And it's about what happens when the people who raised us become, in our eyes, inconvenient. If stories like this move you, if they make you reflect on your own family, subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue telling the kinds of stories that don't just entertain, but confront something real. Now let me tell you why this particular story unsettled me in a way I couldn't shake. I've spent years listening to family stories. The ones people whisper about over coffee. The ones they carry like stones in their chest. And I've learned that family fractures rarely begin with a single explosive moment. They begin with small shifts in perception. A mother becomes dependent. A father becomes a financial burden. A grandparent becomes in the way. Language changes first. And when language changes, relationships follow. Hilda Thompson had been a nurse before she married. She had worked long shifts in hospital corridors that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. She had raised a daughter, supported a husband through 5 years of cancer treatments, babysat grandchildren every weekend without complaint. She had given her adult life to the slow, invisible labor that keeps families intact. And yet, 3 weeks after the funeral, her daughter Harlow stood at the kitchen counter, set down a designer purse, and said with frightening calm, "Daddy left everything to me. I can't afford to support you anymore." There was no screaming. No dramatic meltdown. Just clean, efficient detachment. And that's what makes it so disturbing. Because cruelty delivered calmly feels justified. Hilda offered $800 a month from her Social Security. $800. She said it with trembling hands, as if bargaining for space in a house she once ran. Harlow laughed. Not loudly. Not theatrically. Just enough to signal insufficiency. That doesn't even cover utilities. Here's what I keep asking myself. At what point does a parent stop being the foundation of a family and start being treated like overhead? We live in a culture obsessed with independence. We celebrate people who stand on their own 2 feet. But we forget that every single one of us was carried once. Fed once. Protected once. Someone sacrificed sleep so we could grow. When Harlow said, "I can't carry you forever," I heard something deeper than financial anxiety. I heard fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of regression. Fear that caring for a parent might swallow her own carefully constructed life. And I understand that fear. Adult children today juggle mortgages, student loans, careers, childcare. The pressure is real. But pressure does not excuse dehumanization. What happened next still feels surreal. Instead of offering comfort, Harlow offered a solution. A live-in caregiving job for a paralyzed billionaire. Round-the-clock companionship. Excellent pay. Immediate interview scheduled. It wasn't framed as opportunity. It was framed as an exit strategy. Work or leave. Earn your place or lose it. The next morning, Hilda stood outside a mansion whose driveway was longer than the street where she had once raised her daughter. 68 years old. Grieving. Uncertain. Ringing a doorbell not because she was ambitious, but because she had nowhere else to go. And this is the question that has stayed with me since I first heard her story. What happens to dignity when survival becomes conditional? Because that's what this was. Conditional belonging. We like to imagine that family is unconditional. That blood guarantees safety. But sometimes the most destabilizing displacement happens inside the walls you once called home. As she stepped onto marble floors and into the presence of Terence Hawthorne, A man who had dismissed 17 caregivers in 2 years. Hilda did not know she was walking toward something that would rewrite her entire understanding of love, loss and worth. But before we get there, before we uncover the past that ties them together in ways neither of them expected, I want you to hold on to this moment. A widow in black. A shattered coffee cup on white tile. A daughter who sees numbers instead of sacrifice. A mother who must prove her right to remain. This isn't just a story about romance. It's a story about displacement inside one's own family. And if you've ever wondered whether it's too late to reclaim your place in the world, whether at 68 or 75, or after everything you built feels like it slipped away, stay with me. Because sometimes the door that closes the hardest is the one that leads you exactly where you were meant to be. And what waited behind that mansion door was not just employment. It was unfinished history. What waited behind that mansion door was not just employment, but a different kind of reckoning, one that had nothing to do with eviction and everything to do with control. When Hilda first stepped inside Terence Hawthorne's estate, she expected intimidation. What she didn't expect was silence. Not the peaceful kind, the curated kind, the kind that feels engineered. The floors were marble but not warm. The chandeliers sparkled but not invitingly. The walls were lined with art chosen not for comfort, but for stature. Every object seemed to say the same thing. This house is built on precision. And in the center of that precision sat a man who had once controlled boardrooms the way conductors control orchestras. Terence Hawthorne had been paralyzed from the waist down 5 years earlier. An accident. Sudden. Unforgiving. The kind of event that doesn't just alter your body, it fractures your identity. I've noticed something about people who lose physical autonomy after decades of authority. They don't just grieve mobility. They grieve influence. They grieve the illusion of invincibility. And they cling fiercely to whatever control remains. 17 caregivers in 2 years. That number doesn't point to incompetence on their part. Points to something else. He wanted his coffee at exactly 7:15. The newspaper arranged in a specific order. Medication administered without deviation. If a glass was placed 2 inches off-center, he noticed. If a routine shifted by 5 minutes, he commented. At first glance it sounds like arrogance. But when you look closer it feels like compensation. When the body betrays you, the mind tightens its grip on structure. Control becomes the last proof that you still matter. Hilda understood this instinctively. She did not challenge his demands. She did not flinch when corrected. She did not perform exaggerated obedience either. She simply followed through, quietly, consistently. There's something powerful about that kind of steadiness, especially to someone who has built walls. And Terence had built them well. He spoke formally. He avoided unnecessary conversation. He did not invite familiarity. The name Mrs. Thompson hung between them like a professional boundary. He had no intention of lowering. Yet he watched her. Not casually. Not dismissively. Intently. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to romanticize what happened next. But what intrigued me wasn't the possibility of attraction. It was recognition without explanation. Have you ever looked at someone and felt unsettled? Not because you disliked them, but because something about them stirred memory you couldn't yet place? That was what began to unfold. He asked small questions that felt strangely specific. Where did you grow up? Did your family move often? Was your grandmother's name German? Individually, they were harmless. Together, they felt like pieces of a puzzle being turned over slowly. Upstairs, in a guest suite larger than the apartment she had once shared with her husband, Hilda unpacked the few belongings her daughter had permitted her to bring. Practical clothes. A jewelry box. 3 old photo albums she had packed without thinking. I find that detail telling. When we are forced to leave quickly, we don't pack what is valuable. We pack what is unresolved. One evening, after Terence had retired early, she opened the older album. Not the one from her marriage. The one from before. The pages were fragile. The corners worn. And somewhere between a high school graduation photo and a county fair snapshot, she found herself staring at a young man with dark hair and blue eyes that carried ambition like a spark. Her breath changed. Memory doesn't return politely. Crashes. The lake. The diner. The promise to come back. The train platform goodbye. Terry. Not Terence. Terry. Downstairs, the man in the wheelchair stared out at manicured gardens he had designed but could no longer walk through. Upstairs, the woman he once intended to marry realized that the face she had been avoiding looking at too closely all week belonged to someone she had loved almost half a century ago. Now here's what fascinates me most about this stage of the story. Neither of them acknowledged it immediately. Recognition is destabilizing. It threatens the identities you've curated. Hilda was not a young girl anymore. She was a widow, a grandmother, a displaced mother trying to remain composed. Terence was not a dreamer chasing empire. He was empire, hardened by success, narrowed by betrayal, reshaped by disability. To admit familiarity would mean admitting vulnerability, and vulnerability for both of them carried risk. So they circled the truth. He mentioned a small town called Millbrook. She deflected. He referenced a diner by a lake. She shifted the conversation. But he remembered details no stranger could invent. And she felt it in her chest. The unsettling awareness that perhaps the door she had wrung out of desperation had opened onto unfinished history. Let me tell you what I find most compelling here. This was not nostalgia. It was convergence. Two lives that had diverged based on misunderstanding, now intersecting under entirely different circumstances. And what makes this powerful isn't that they were once in love. It's that neither of them had fully resolved that chapter. We often think time erases intensity, that 48 years is enough to dissolve longing. But unresolved love doesn't evaporate. It compresses. It shapes how we attach, how we trust, how we guard ourselves. Terence had never married. Hilda had built a stable life with another man. Both choices were real. Both lives mattered. But beneath them lay a fracture that had never fully sealed. As the days passed inside that meticulously ordered house, something shifted in the air. Not dramatic, not declared, just an undercurrent. And I found myself wondering, because this is what I do when I listen to family stories, what happens when the version of yourself someone loved before the world hardened you suddenly reappears? Is that a gift? Or is it a test? Because recognition is only the beginning. What follows is confrontation with memory, with pride, and with the choices that once felt irreversible. And what follows recognition, if we're honest, is not romance, it is reckoning. Once the possibility settled between them, once the air in that mansion felt charged with something neither of them could dismiss as coincidence, the past stopped being a quiet memory and became a living presence in the room. Didn't explode all at once. Unfolded in fragments. A name spoken too carefully. A question held a beat too long. A detail remembered with unsettling precision. Terence didn't ask, "Are you Hilda Brennan?" Not yet. Instead, he asked about Millbrook with a restraint that almost felt surgical. He mentioned Murphy's Diner as if recalling a business trip from decades ago. He described a lake where young couples used to gather on Sunday afternoons. He wasn't fishing for information. He was testing for truth. And I want to pause here, because this is the moment where pride becomes the most dangerous force in a story. Hilda could have said it immediately. She could have laughed softly and said, "Terry, it's me." But 48 years is not a small stretch of time. Carries marriages, children, losses, regrets, and the weight of what might have been. To admit recognition was to admit that a version of herself had never fully disappeared. It was also to confront a wound she had sealed over decades ago. You see, the story she had lived with all these years was simple. He left. He promised to return. His letters slowed. Then they stopped. She waited. Then she married someone who was steady and present. She built a life. That narrative had sustained her. But upstairs in that guest suite, when she reopened the old album and found the letter he had sent announcing his return, dated 3 weeks after her wedding, her understanding fractured. He had not abandoned her. He had come back. And the letters that vanished? They had been intercepted by business partners who believed a small-town girl would weaken his ambition. I want you to think about the violence of that, not physical violence but narrative violence. Two young people separated not by lack of love, but by manipulation and ego-driven interference. How many lives are built on misunderstandings that no one bothered to correct? How many marriages, careers, relocations, hardened personalities stem from silence that was never meant to exist? When Terence finally said her full name, Hilda Marie Brennan, it was no longer subtle. It was confirmation. And in that moment something in both of them gave way. He remembered the yellow dress she wore the summer before he left. The scar on her knee from falling off her bike. The way she insisted cherry coke was better than vanilla, even though she always found it too sweet. Those are not facts you invent. Those are memories you carry. And what moved me most about this part of the story was not the revelation itself. It was the vulnerability that followed. Terrence admitted he had never married. Not because he lacked opportunity. Not because wealth limited his options. But because no one else had felt like home. That confession was not romantic in a cinematic sense. It was quiet. Almost weary. 48 years of success. 48 years of building structures that touched the skyline. And yet, the one structure he had never rebuilt was the one that mattered most. Hilda, on the other hand, did marry. She loved Dante. That love was real. It shaped her. Produced a daughter. It carried her through decades. But acknowledging that did not negate what she felt sitting across from Terrence now. And this is where I think many people grow uncomfortable. We prefer clean emotional math. One great love. One permanent devotion. One storyline. But human attachment does not follow a single-threaded narrative. You can love deeply more than once. You can grieve honestly and still rediscover joy. You can have built a full life with one person and still carry unfinished tenderness for another. The key difference is integrity. Hilda did not pretend her marriage to Dante had been a placeholder. It wasn't. It was her life. Terrence did not attempt to rewrite the past as if she had betrayed him. He acknowledged his own role in leaving. In prioritizing ambition. In trusting the wrong advisors. They were not trying to erase the decades between them. They were trying to understand them. And that distinction is everything. Recognition does not resurrect youth. It confronts consequence. The young couple by the lake believed love would survive ambition. The older man in the wheelchair and the widow in the conservatory understood that love survives only when protected from ego. When Terrence asked her quietly, "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" The question carried more than curiosity. It carried fear. Fear that he had once again arrived too late. Hilda's answer was simple and devastating. "I was afraid. Afraid that he wasn't the boy she remembered. Afraid that she wasn't the girl he loved. Afraid that opening that door would unravel the stability she had spent decades constructing." Fear keeps people apart longer than distance ever could. But once spoken, it loses power. As they sat there, two lives layered with history, regret, and endurance, the past stopped being a ghost and became a choice. And that is where this story shifts from memory to decision. Because recognition alone does not guarantee reconciliation. It only opens the possibility. What you do with that possibility determines whether love becomes redemption or repetition. But possibility, especially when it threatens the existing order of a family, never arrives without resistance. The moment Hilda and Terrence stopped pretending that their recognition was coincidence, the balance of power shifted, and Harlow felt it before anyone said it out loud. I've seen this dynamic before in family stories. When an aging parent begins to reclaim autonomy, adult children often experience it not as liberation, but as loss. Loss of control. Loss of predictability. Loss of inheritance, financial or emotional. When word reached Harlow that her mother was spending time outside the strict boundaries of employment, she did not approach it as a daughter curious about her mother's happiness. She approached it as a manager investigating risk. That distinction matters. She asked blunt questions. Questions about impropriety. About boundaries. About what people might think. But underneath the concern was something sharper, suspicion. Suspicion that her mother had orchestrated something. Suspicion that vulnerability and wealth in the same room must mean manipulation. And this is where the accusation of gold digger surfaced, not as a shouted insult, but as an implication woven through every sentence. I want to examine that word carefully. Gold digger is rarely about money alone. It is about control. It suggests intent. Strategy. It frames a woman's affection as calculated. Notice how easily society assigns that narrative to older women who enter relationships with wealthy men. We question her motives before we question his choice. As if a billionaire could not possibly act from desire or longing, only from exploitation. Harlow requested a formal meeting. Not a family conversation. A meeting. Terence insisted it take place in his study. If this was to be treated as negotiation, he would meet it with clarity. I imagine that room vividly. The mahogany desk, the measured lighting, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to contracts. Harlow arrived polished, composed, ready to articulate concerns that sounded reasonable on the surface. She spoke about vulnerability, about her mother's grief, about how quickly relationships can distort judgment. And here's the part that struck me. None of what she said was entirely false. Grief does make people susceptible. Sudden closeness can blur lines. Wealth can complicate trust. But concern becomes corrosive when it is driven by fear rather than love. Terence listened without interruption. And then he asked a simple question. How long would your mother be welcome in your home? It was not asked cruelly. It was asked factually. And suddenly the conversation shifted from moral accusation to measurable reality. Harlow had offered $800 as insufficient. Terence cited average rent, utility costs, the gap between income and survival. The numbers did not support her narrative of protection. And this is where projection became undeniable. Projection allows us to accuse others of the very impulses we fear within ourselves. If Hilda was greedy, then Harlow's ultimatum was justified. If Hilda was opportunistic, then pushing her out was a lesson in independence. But when Terence calmly revealed that he had already revised his will, directing his estate toward charities, hospitals, shelters, he dismantled the financial premise entirely. Hilda would inherit nothing. Not a cent. The air in that room must have shifted in a way no chandelier could soften. Because once money was removed from the equation, what remained was far more uncomfortable. Harlow's fear was not about inheritance. It was about irrelevance. For months she had been the authority, the decision-maker, the one who dictated terms. Now her mother had chosen a life that did not require her permission. That kind of independence can feel like betrayal to someone who equates control with care. When Harlow called her mother high maintenance, accused her of smothering, of emotional dependency, I heard something deeper than insult. I heard resentment that had been building for years. Resentment that often develops when adult children feel unseen in their own struggles. Perhaps she had felt overshadowed by her mother's sacrifices. Perhaps she had grown tired of being the beneficiary of invisible labor she never asked for. Family resentment is rarely one-directional. It accumulates quietly. But resentment does not justify humiliation. When Hilda reminded her daughter of working 2 jobs to pay tuition, of caregiving through cancer, of weekends spent babysitting without complaint, she was not weaponizing sacrifice. She was restoring context. And context can be devastating when it contradicts the story you've told yourself. Terence's final statement in that meeting was not aggressive. It was declarative. Your mother is not a gold digger. Simple, firm, public. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do for someone you love is defend their dignity without asking them to beg for it. Harlow left that room shaken. Not because she had been defeated, but because the narrative she relied on had collapsed. When suspicion loses its evidence, it either transforms into reflection, or hardens into bitterness. At that point in the story it could have gone either way. What fascinates me most is this. The confrontation was not about romance. It was about agency. Hilda was no longer asking to stay. She was choosing where to stand. And when an aging parent chooses autonomy instead of compliance, it forces every family member to confront their own definition of love. Is love control? Is love protection? Or is love allowing someone to rebuild? Even if it unsettles you, the answer to that question would determine whether this family fractured permanently, or evolved into something stronger. And once agency is reclaimed, the next question is unavoidable. What do you build with it? After the confrontation in the study, something subtle but irreversible had shifted. The accusations had been aired. The financial suspicion had been dismantled. The old love had been acknowledged. What remained was no longer tension, it was choice. Terence did not rush. That's something I respect deeply about this part of the story. He did not sweep Hilda into a grand declaration as if 48 years could be compressed into a single dramatic moment. Instead, he asked her quietly if she would consider moving into the master wing, not as his caregiver but as his companion. That word matters. Companion suggests equality. It suggests presence without hierarchy. It implies that what connects two people is not dependency, not obligation, not even nostalgia, but mutual intention. For Hilda, this was not a romantic fantasy fulfilled. It was a risk. Let's be honest about something rarely spoken aloud. Society is far more comfortable with older women surviving than with older women desiring. Widowhood earns sympathy. Remarriage invites scrutiny. When a man in his 70s remarries, people nod. They call it companionship. They say he deserves happiness. When a woman does the same, especially to someone wealthy, the questions sharpen. Is she lonely? Is she naive? Is she calculating? Hilda understood that every choice from this point forward would be interpreted through someone else's lens. That's why the conversation about money resurfaced before any talk of vows. Terence asked her plainly if she wanted his wealth. It was not romantic and it was not entirely fair. But it was honest. And I find honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, more powerful than idealized silence. He had been burned before, by business partners, by opportunists, by people who saw fortune before they saw him. Suspicion had become a reflex. Hilda's response was not defensive. It was decisive. She told him to leave everything to charity. Not as a gesture. Not as a performance. As a boundary. That moment, to me, is where this story transcends sentimentality. Because love without boundaries becomes vulnerability without protection. And Hilda was no longer a woman willing to exchange security for affection. By asking him to remove her from the will, she was removing the narrative that could be weaponized against her. If she stayed, it would be because she chose him, not because she might inherit him. 3 weeks later they married quietly. No spectacle. No dramatica non cement. Just a simple ceremony in the conservatory where recognition had first resurfaced. I picture the light that morning. Filtered through glass walls, gentle, unpretentious. A gold band exchanged without diamonds, without excess. At 20 Terry had promised her a life of grandeur. At 70 he offered steadiness. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson here. Youth dreams in scale. Age dreams in depth. The wedding was not about reclaiming lost time. It was about honoring present time. Now I want to talk about grief because this is where many people misinterpret stories like this. Some believe that remarrying after widowhood means erasing the past. That it diminishes the first marriage. That it signals emotional disloyalty. I don't see it that way. Grief does not require permanence to be valid. You can love someone fully, lose them, mourn them honestly, and still choose life afterward. Hilda did not stop loving Dante the moment she said yes to Terence. She did not rewrite history. She did not invalidate decades of partnership. But she refused to let memory become a cage. And that refusal takes courage. Especially when your own child has already accused you of moral failure. The silence from Harlow in the months following the marriage was heavy. There were no congratulatory calls. No visites. Just distance. But sometimes silence is processing, not punishment. Harlow had to confront something uncomfortable. Her mother was no longer vulnerable in the way she had imagined. She was not dependent. She was not scrambling for survival. She was chosen. And being chosen after being discarded changes how you carry yourself. Hilda walked differently in that house now. Not because of wealth but because of certainty. She no longer entered rooms apologetically. She did not wait for approval. She did not negotiate her place at the table. She belonged. Not because someone allowed her to, but because she decided to. And that's what unsettles people most. When someone you thought you had defined for years redefines themselves without your permission. Love in later life is not rebellion. It is reclamation. Says, I am still capable of connection. I am still worthy of devotion. I am not finished simply because my past chapter closed. As Terence adjusted to life not as employer but as husband, something softened in him as well. The rigid routines loosened. The sharp edges of control dulled. He laughed more. He listened more. Success had made him powerful. Vulnerability made him human. And in that quiet rhythm, morning coffee in the conservatory, evenings in the garden, conversations unhurried by ambition, something extraordinary happened. They stopped living as if time were something to conquer. They began living as if time were something to cherish. But even as stability settled in, the past had not finished speaking. Because just when Hilda had made peace with loving again, a revelation from her first marriage would force her, and her daughter, to confront a truth neither had been prepared for. And that truth would test not just romance but forgiveness itself. Just when it seemed that love had finally settled into something steady and earned, the past rose again, this time not from Terence's history but from Dante's. Harlow arrived at the house months after the wedding with a look I've seen before in people who have uncovered something they wish they hadn't. Not anger exactly. Not grief in its pure form. It was disorientation. The kind that happens when a belief you've leaned on your whole life suddenly cracks. She had gone through her father's papers. Not casually. Not curiously. She had been searching. What she found were letters, intimate, deliberate, unmistakable, written to a woman named Jennifer. Dated 2 years before Dante died. 2 years. While Hilda was managing hospital visits. While she was organizing medications. While she was adjusting pillows at night so he could breathe more comfortably. While she was trying to memorize the sound of his voice before it faded. I've listened to enough family stories to know this. The betrayal itself is only part of the wound. The deeper fracture is the collapse of narrative. Harlow had built her understanding of loyalty on her parents' marriage. In her mind it had been stable, faithful, reliable. It was the moral contrast to what she feared in her mother's new relationship. And now that anchor was gone. When she told Hilda about the letters, she wasn't trying to hurt her. She was unraveling in real time. There's something psychologically complex about discovering a parent's infidelity after their death. You cannot confront them. You cannot demand explanation. You cannot renegotiate the truth. You are left holding incomplete answers. And often when we cannot confront the source of pain, we redirect it. I believe that's what Harlow had been doing all along. When she pushed her mother out. When she accused her of opportunism. When she policed her morality. She wasn't just protecting inheritance. She was protecting the illusion that her father's love had been pure and singular. If her mother moved on too easily, it threatened that illusion. If her mother could love again, perhaps her father had not been irreplaceable. But the letters revealed something even more destabilizing. Dante himself had been imperfect, capable of tenderness and deception in the same breath. That duality is difficult to process. Hilda's reaction is what moved me most. She did not crumble. She did not lash out. She did not rewrite her entire marriage as a lie. She said quietly that she was sad, but not angry. That response is not denial. It is maturity. Love, especially long marriages, is rarely a single unbroken line. It contains seasons, failures, compromises, moments of weakness. Dante's affair did not erase the decades they built together. It did not invalidate the care she gave him in his final years. But it did release her from something she hadn't fully named. Guilt. Somewhere deep inside, she had carried a quiet fear that loving Terence again was a betrayal of Dante's memory. The revelation shifted that weight. Not because infidelity justifies anything, but because it reminds us that loyalty is not a one-sided monument. Harlow confessed that she had been furious, not just at her father but at her mother. She had blamed Hilda for not being enough, then blamed her for being too much. She had internalized the betrayal as a failure in the household she grew up in. That's something we don't talk about often enough. Children often absorb parental infidelity as commentary on the entire family system. It shakes their sense of stability. It makes them question their own future relationships. Harlow had projected that instability onto her mother's new marriage. If the first marriage wasn't perfect, then perhaps no marriage was safe. It was easier to control Hilda than to face that uncertainty. When she apologized, it wasn't theatrical. It was fractured, honest. She admitted she had been cruel, that she had been jealous, not of wealth, but of her mother's ability to rebuild. Jealousy is rarely about possession. It's about fear of being left behind. Hilda forgave her, but she did something critical that too many people skip in moments like this. She did not revert. She did not pretend nothing had happened. She did not invite her daughter back into unquestioned access. She set terms. Respect my marriage. Respect my choices. Respect my autonomy. Forgiveness without boundaries invites repetition. Forgiveness with boundaries invites growth. Terence, watching the exchange, remained mostly silent, but present. That presence mattered. He did not insert himself as savior. He did not demand allegiance. He allowed mother and daughter to renegotiate their bond without dominance. That restraint is another quiet form of love. What strikes me most about this chapter is that the affair revelation did not destroy anyone. It clarified everyone. It clarified that Dante had been human. It clarified that Harlow's anger had roots deeper than greed. It clarified that Hilda's right to love again did not need to be defended against memory. And perhaps most importantly, it clarified that family reconciliation requires truth, even when that truth complicates the version of the past we preferred. By the time Harlow asked her mother, "Are you really happy?" the question no longer carried accusation. It carried vulnerability. And when Hilda answered yes, it was not defiance. It was peace. The past had been confronted, the resentment named, the illusion dismantled. What remained was a choice: to hold on to bitterness, or to step into a new definition of family, one that allowed imperfection without erasing love. And that choice is where this story finds its true resolution. And once the truth had been spoken aloud, what remained was not accusation or defense, but choice. I've come to believe that the real turning points in family stories are rarely the dramatic confrontations. They are the quiet decisions that follow, the ones no one applauds, the ones that determine whether pain becomes permanent distance or painful growth. After the letters were revealed, after Harlow admitted her jealousy and her misdirected anger, something subtle changed in the room. The dynamic shifted from control to humility. Harlow was no longer standing across from her mother like an evaluator. She was sitting beside her like a daughter who finally understood she had misunderstood. And I think that's the difference between apology and transformation. An apology acknowledges behavior. Transformation acknowledges perspective. When Harlow asked her mother if she could forgive her, the question carried more than regret. It carried fear. Fear that the door she had slammed months earlier might now be closed to her. Hilda's answer was gentle but firm. "Yes, forgive you. But we can't go back to how things were." That sentence holds more wisdom than most of us are taught. We are often raised to believe that forgiveness means restoration of the original dynamic. That if love is real, everything returns to its previous shape. But sometimes the previous shape was the problem. Hilda did not want her daughter out of her life. She wanted her daughter in her life differently, with respect, without ultimatums, without moral surveillance, without financial suspicion masquerading as concern. Boundaries are not rejection. They are clarity. And clarity, when spoken calmly, can rebuild what anger once threatened to destroy. I picture that garden where Hilda and Terence sat later that evening. The light softer, the air steadier. Not because everything had been erased, but because everything had been acknowledged. Hilda had lost a husband. She had been displaced from her own home. She had rediscovered a first love she believed was gone forever. She had been accused, defended, doubted, chosen, and tested. And yet, she did not become hardened. That's what moves me most. She did not allow betrayal, whether from her daughter or her late husband, to define her future posture. She allowed it to inform her boundaries. Terence too had changed. The man who once clung to control as proof of strength now sat beside her without needing to orchestrate the moment. He had defended her publicly, but he did not attempt to manage her reconciliation with Harlow. There's a maturity in that restraint. He understood that love does not mean isolating someone from their family. It means trusting them to navigate it. Harlow's transformation was quieter, but no less significant. She had to confront the fact that she had confused protection with possession, that she had equated independence with abandonment, that she had mistaken her mother's second chance for disloyalty. That's not an easy realization, but growth rarely is. Family, I've learned, is not defined by who holds power. It's defined by who is willing to release it. Harlow released control. Hilda released resentment. Terence released suspicion. And what replaced those releases was something far more stable than inheritance or obligation. It was mutual recognition. Recognition that love does not expire at 68. Recognition that grief and joy can coexist without canceling each other out. Recognition that parents are not static figures frozen in the roles their children prefer. They are human beings, capable of evolving, desiring, failing, forgiving. When I think about this story, I don't see a widow marrying a billionaire. I see a woman reclaiming her right to be chosen. I see a daughter learning that control is not the same as care. I see a man realizing that legacy without companionship is hollow. And I ask myself the same question I want to ask you now. What would you have done in Hilda's place? Would you have stayed quiet to preserve comfort? Would you have returned to a house where you were tolerated but not valued? Would you have declined love to avoid judgment? Or would you have risked misunderstanding in order to rebuild something honest? Family stories are never simple. They are layered with memory, ego, sacrifice, pride, and longing. But at their core, they always circle back to the same thing: dignity. The dignity to say no. The dignity to say yes. The dignity to forgive without surrendering yourself. As the sun set over that garden, Hilda leaned back in her chair beside the man who had once promised her a future and finally kept that promise in a different form. Not through wealth. Not through spectacle. Through presence. And maybe that's the quiet lesson here. Sometimes the life you thought you lost was never truly lost. It was waiting for you to become brave enough to choose it again. When I step back and look at Hilda's journey, what stays with me isn't the mansion, the inheritance, or even the rediscovered first love. It's the quiet transformation of a woman who refused to let displacement define her. She was widowed, dismissed, doubted, and morally judged. She faced the collapse of one life and the uncertainty of another. Yet at every crossroads, she chose dignity over desperation, clarity over silence, and courage over comfort. She did not chase wealth. She did not cling to resentment. She did not allow grief to become a permanent identity. Instead, she made deliberate decisions about love, about boundaries, about forgiveness. And in doing so, she rebuilt her life not from fantasy, but from self-respect. What makes this story powerful is not that she found a billionaire. It's that she found herself again. She discovered that being needed is not the same as being valued, that forgiveness does not require surrender, and that it is never too late to choose a life that feels honest. Sometimes the most radical act is not revenge, not proving someone wrong, but simply standing up and saying, "I still matter." The deeper lesson here is this: your worth does not expire when circumstances change. Age, loss, financial dependence, or family conflict do not reduce your right to happiness. But happiness without boundaries leads to repetition. So if there is something to apply to our own lives, it is this: choose courage but choose clarity with it. Forgive but define your limits. Love but do not shrink. And when someone you care about evolves, resist the urge to control what you don't understand. Instead, ask better questions. Now I'm curious about you. If you were in Hilda's place, would you have chosen safety or second chances? Share your answer in the comments so we can learn from each other's perspectives. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to support the channel. It helps us continue bringing meaningful human stories to life.